Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom. I'm the creator of rulingplanets.com and Christopher Renstrom Astrology. And I want to welcome you to my November horoscope forecast for 2025. On November 2nd, Venus forms a square to Jupiter. People can get aggressively passive-aggressive when these two benefics form a square to each other in the zodiac signs of Cancer and Libra. That's because Cancers and Libras always want the other one to go first. Rather than be upfront, they prefer to drop hints, imply yes when actually saying no, and circle around the point in hopes of exhausting the other party's patience and resistance. Unfortunately, the other party wants what they want just as much as you do. This could go on endlessly, like a rudderless ship spinning in circles, if you don't bite the bullet and ask for what you want. Chances are that once it's out in the open, you'll get the answer you were hoping for. The other party was simply waiting for you to take the lead. Signs most affected are Aries, Taurus, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn, and Pisces. From November 3rd to November 4th, we will be experiencing a Mars transit bundle. What that means is that no sooner does Mars form an aspect to one planet, then it's going to form an aspect to another planet. So one idea follows immediately on the heels of another idea. Now, if these aspects were conducive to one another, you get the idea of something being good being made better as a result. Or if these aspects are not conducive to one another, you get the idea of something hard being made even more difficult or being made even more challenging. What we get here is really fascinating because on November 3rd, Mars will be forming a trine to Neptune. Now, Mars will be at the very last degree of Scorpio, the zodiac sign that it rules. So Mars will be at 29 degrees Scorpio, which we call the anaretic degree. And it will be forming a trine to Neptune at 29 degrees Pisces, which we also refer to as the anaretic degree. Now, what's fascinating here is that Mars is in the zodiac sign of Scorpio, as I said, the zodiac sign that it rules. And Neptune is also in the zodiac sign that it rules, which is Pisces. All right. So this is supposed to be something that's very conducive. And typically it would be, except for the fact that Neptune is now retrograde or moving backwards in the sky. So what's happening here is that Mars wants to move forward. I mean, Mars is the planet that goes after the thing that it wants. It spots something that it wants and it says, I want that, and it races after it. But it's going into a trine with Neptune, which is moving backwards. Okay, so Mars's forward thrust is now moving backwards. So we take a moment and we're like, Mars's forward thrust is now moving backwards. Like, what does that mean? And that's a good question. What does that mean? I've got it. What it basically means is that Mars is moving towards a target, something that it wants, but the idea is that what it wants is moving backwards. So what we're experiencing here is that Mars is being led back to a situation that it thought it was leaving, or a situation that it thought it had resolved, or a situation that it thought that it had taken care of. So suddenly what Mars wants is not to be away or over the hurdle or moving forward, but what Mars wants is to go back to what it had before. So this can be a sort of kind of morning after syndrome, and like one might be asking, well, what was I thinking? Or like, ooh, I made the wrong choice. I need to double back and fix things before things are ruined forever. Something along those lines. Neptune is the planet of illusion. It basically brings out our yearnings, our longings for something. So when we've got a Mars-Neptune trine, it can be sort of the what came over me transit. You know, it's kind of like, what was I thinking? But it's also like you're under a spell, a hypnotic spell. It reminds me of Mowgli in Walt Disney's animation film, Jungle Book, in which Mowgli is hypnotized by Kaa, this boa constrictor, and Kaa calls to Mowgli, and Mowgli's eyes turn around in circles and things like that, and he's completely hypnotized. And Ka, of course, is leading Mowgli into his maw. He wants to swallow Mowgli. And this might be the feeling that you might be experiencing, that you're going back to something, you're under its spell, there's a seductive quality, maybe there's a profound regret, and that you need to get back to it. But where you're going is actually not a good place. Mars wants to be moving forward. It doesn't want to be moving backwards. And so this kind of being under the influence or under the spell of something which you had just left or you had finalized or you had made your decision about, now you might be going back to sort of undo it or to fix it in your mind's eye. And of course, no sooner do you want to go and do this, and you're maybe even coming to the point of committing to someone or going back to a job that you had just left or something along those lines, when all of a sudden Mars changes zodiac signs. And Mars changes zodiac signs on November 4th. It's the day after November 3rd. And so when a planet changes zodiac signs, it's like a person going from one country to another or one hemisphere to another. Like imagine you left, or maybe even interstate. Like imagine that you left Massachusetts in the middle of a rainstorm and there's snow on the way and your plane lands in Florida, where it's clear skies and it's very warm and it's wonderful. That's what a planet changing signs can be like. And indeed, we have Mars going from Scorpio, which is a watery sign, to Sagittarius, which is a fiery sign. And no sooner does Mars change zodiac signs than it forms an opposition to Uranus. And Uranus is kind of like lights on, and everyone up and awake. Okay, Uranus is the awakener. It's the planet of revolution and change. And so this may be the sudden jolt that comes to your senses, that on one day you were like, oh, I have to go back to this situation. And I know that I tried before and things didn't work out, but maybe I can try again. And then the following day, it's like, my goodness, what was I thinking? That's crazy. I have to get out of this situation that I'm running back to. So it's a sudden jolt that sort of brings you to your senses and leaves you wondering, what was I thinking? And you may escape what might have been a bad choice in the nick of time, but that also means that you may have to go running after the person that you had said no to, and now you mean yes, or you may have to say to the person who was ready to hire you back again, you know what, that's not going to work, and sorry, something along those lines. You'll be saved in the nick of time, but at the same time, you may have some explaining to do, but it will be worth it in the end. Signs most affected are Aries, Gemini, Cancer, Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Pisces. On November 5th, there will be a full moon in Taurus. Sometimes the stars will make the decisions we can't. It's something you can take comfort in. When the full moon in Taurus signals the final rupture in a situation that was barely held together by spit and glue. You knew this day would come, but somehow felt it lay further down the road. Now, whether the end result is good or bad depends on what you make of things. It's true that you haven't been especially proactive or daring lately, but all of that changes when your interests are at stake. So get ready to do the things you never thought yourself capable of doing before, and all for the right reasons. Signs most affected are Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, and Capricorn. On November 6th, Venus enters the zodiac sign of Scorpio. Venus in Scorpio is what I call the film noir Venus. Venus in Scorpio often attracts people with shady pasts. Hard-bitten guys with sardonic one-liners and shady femme fatales with sultry looks are your kryptonite. You know better than to be drawn in, but that doesn't stop you from falling for them every time. Why? Because you know that they've got a dirty secret locked up inside, and you want to find out what it is. And once unearthed, who knows? Maybe you'll release them from their curse, or they'll release you from yours. Venus is in detriment in Scorpio, and that's because Scorpio is a Mars-ruled sign. And what that means is that you're more into damaged goods than pretty faces. And it also means that you tend to attract people who spell trouble. Now, some might say that you're being self-sabotaging, but your perfect mate is someone who knows what it's like to have gone to hell and back. Someone who understands your regrets and your shames. You can't ask for a sweeter obsession than this. Venus will be in Scorpio from November 6th until November 30th. Signs most affected are Taurus, Libra, and Scorpio. On November 7th, Uranus retrogrades back down into the zodiac sign of Taurus. There was a phrase in Silicon Valley that was embraced by many of the tech bros, and it was move fast and break things. Now, the idea was to be relentlessly revolutionary and innovative. So revolutionary and innovative that the old ways of being were being trampled underfoot, and people had no choice but to move forward into the future. And that's pretty much what happened during the time that Uranus was traveling through the zodiac sign of Taurus, and that was from May 2018 until this year. Now, Uranus entered the zodiac sign of Gemini on July 7th, and no sooner did Uranus enter the zodiac sign of Gemini on July 7th, then it turned retrograde on September 6th. So we don't really have a true feeling for what Uranus in Gemini really means yet. But we will, given time, because when Uranus re-enters Gemini at the beginning of next year, we will have 7 years of Uranus in that zodiac sign. So what does it mean that Uranus is now returning to the zodiac sign of Taurus? Does that mean that it's going to wreak more havoc in our lives? Something that comes to mind when I think of Uranus returning to the zodiac sign of Taurus is that there's a difference between stampeding cattle and herding cattle. In other words, anyone can shoot a gun off in the air and send the cattle stampeding in all directions, but it takes a lot more effort, cunning, skill, and talent to be able to herd that cattle back together again and to move them from one point to another point, from point A to point B. In other words, the question that we have with Uranus returning to Taurus during this time is how can we move things in a more enlightened direction? We often talk about Uranus being the planet of revolution and change, but Uranus is also the planet of revelation, because it was during the time that Uranus was discovered that we had electricity becoming something that could actually be used to illuminate our buildings and streets and our lives. So instead of building back, which is what people kind of think when things have been laid low, when they've been trampled underfoot, instead of building back, perhaps the spirit of invention we should be embracing is building anew. Moving fast and breaking things is unsustainable. Any 2-year-old can do that. What you have to do is slow down and create. So what Uranus has given us, at first it feels like it's a wild curveball out of left field, the destruction of the way that things have been, institutions or structures that we always thought would live forever. By that being laid low, there's also something that's very liberating or very freeing. Suddenly those structures, those rules or laws that said you can't do this, or this is the way that things are always going to be, suddenly they're not there anymore. So do we really want to recreate that? Or do we want to build something new from that? And that's where necessity becomes the mother of invention. Now that we can't go back to the way that things were before, that also doesn't mean that we throw ourselves headlong into the future without looking at where we're rushing to. I mean, Uranus is in the zodiac sign of Taurus, and Taurus really wants an end result, and Taurus keeps an eye on where things are going. It doesn't want to throw itself headlong into something chaotic. Okay, but if we take on this idea that old things that were broken, old systems that weren't working are no longer there, and if we take this idea of slowing down and creating, being more constructive, then we might be able to build something much better than what we had before. The other idea that I want to share with you about Uranus returning to the zodiac sign of Taurus is that Uranus, as I've often spoken in many episodes before, is the only planet that orbits the sun rotating on its side. So basically, Uranus's north and south poles are where everyone else's equators are. And when you add the fact that Uranus has rings around it, like Saturn does, then Uranus literally is the wheel in the sky that keeps on turning. And like a wheel that turns, you can wind up back where you began. So this idea of Uranus returning to Taurus, this idea of finding yourself back where you began, well, obviously, if you find yourself back where you began, that doesn't mean that you've gone back in time or anything like that. You come back to a place where you were before, where you began. The place might be the same, but you are not. Things have happened in your life. You've had certain experiences. You've grown during this period of time. So this makes you more responsible, more caring, and it gives you an eye for how things will play out in the future. When you find yourself back where you began with all the experiences of what you went through, then you've got a different view of what the future can be. You can draw upon that experience. You can draw upon the things that you learned, and you can move things in your life to the place that you want them to go. Remember that in the end, Taurus, the zodiac sign that Uranus has retrograded back down into, Taurus is an earth sign. So Taurus, as an earth sign, wants to leave the world a better place than it found it, which means that now that Uranus is back in Taurus again, it's not going to be this feeling of dodgeball where things are being hurled at you and you have to dodge them or deal with them. It's going to be more of a feeling of, I've got this. I know what to do with this. I know the mistakes I made. I know the dead ends that I went down. And now I have a clearer eye of where I want to go in the future. And that is the great gift that Uranus, retrograding back down to the zodiac sign of Taurus, has to give you. Signs most affected are Taurus, Leo, Virgo, Scorpio, Capricorn, and Aquarius. On November 9th, Mercury turns retrograde in the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. You're not going to like being grabbed by the scruff of your neck. When Mercury turns retrograde in Sagittarius on November 9th, you were really looking forward to making a lot of progress, to making a lot of headway. But now you'll be forced to deal with all kinds of complications. Complications that will only get worse when Mercury changes zodiac signs on November 18th. On November 18th, Mercury will retrograde back down into Scorpio. And when Mercury is back in Scorpio, it will confront you with certain consequences or technicalities that you breezed past the first time. Maybe it's money that you owed someone, responsibilities that you shirked, or people you crossed. Now, this could be punitive, or you can redirect the energy by doing right by those you hurt. It's often all bets off whenever a planet retrogrades out of sign and back into another. But it's also a do-over, a chance to get things right. Follow this cosmic cue, and you may find that it clears the way to making the progress you were expecting to make when Mercury comes out of retrograde on November 29th. Signs most affected are Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. On November 11th, Jupiter turns retrograde in the zodiac sign of Cancer. Jupiter, the planet of good fortune and higher purpose, will turn retrograde in the zodiac sign of Cancer on November 11th. So what exactly does it mean? Does it mean that everything that was happening to you that was good is suddenly going to turn sour? That all that forward motion that you were making is now going to move backwards and put you in a bad place in your life? Or that higher purpose that called to you suddenly evaporates and you're left feeling disillusioned and desolate? That's not exactly how Jupiter works. Now, I thought long and hard of what it would be like for Jupiter to be turning retrograde in the zodiac sign of Cancer, the zodiac sign of hearth and home and family. And then I thought of this movie that I just saw recently. It's called Nonas. It's a wonderful movie, and you have to go and see it. It's really fantastic. Nonas is basically nonna, and that's the Italian word for grandma or grandmother. And it's the story of this guy named Joe, who's raised by his mother and his grandmother. And, there was always this very strong sense of family, an Italian family with lots of relatives and community. And his mom and his grandma used to like cook for the family and for the community. And people would cook at one house and eat, and then maybe next weekend cook at another house and eat, and all these sorts of things. So there's this strong sense of family and community, real Jupiter in Cancer kind of stuff. But this was before, and the movie is taking place now. And that also brings in the sort of sense of nostalgia that we get whenever we're talking about the zodiac sign of Cancer. Nostalgia for simpler times, nostalgia for hearth and home and family. And indeed, at the beginning of the movie, Joe, who's a middle-aged man, has just lost his mother that he's cared for several years while she was dying. And so his friends are really concerned that, that he's going to stay in the house that he lived in, taking care of his mother, the house that he grew up in, and that he's just going to disappear. He's not going to get out and live, that now he has an opportunity to really live. And what his friends aren't really judging is how much this care came from a place of love, that it wasn't a thankless responsibility or an obligation. He was really involved in the care of his mother, that his mother had given him so many things, and so much of their life revolved around food and care and nurturing. So she passes away, and he gets an amount of money from her for insurance. And she also leaves him a letter. There's an envelope, which is a very thick envelope, and it says Joey that she's left for him that he discovers after the funeral. And his friends are like, oh, go ahead and open it. And he's like, no, I can't, and they're like, why can't you? Maybe it's more money, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And he's like, I can't open the letter that she gave me because whatever is in that envelope, whatever I see in there, that's the final goodbye. That's the last time that I'll have had any contact with her. And I'm just not in the place to do that right now. And so they're like, oh, okay. But what are you going to do? I mean, are you going to continue with your life for the New York City MTA, or what are you going to do with that money? You should go and buy a new house or a car or something wonderful. And he's like, I have to think about it, And he thinks about it. And what he decides that he wants to do, it's crazy, is that he wants to open this restaurant, okay? Because so many of his memories of his mother and her mother, his mother and his Nona, are around cooking, are around feeding people and people coming together and just having joy and fun. Things that he had when he was younger, but haven't really translated to the modern day. There isn't that same sense of community. There isn't that same sense of belonging. Even food doesn't really have the sort of hearth sense that it had before. It's something that's, more of a specialty or an expertise or something along these things. The food has been made a commodity. Love has been made a commodity. And so he sees this old building on Staten Island, and he decides he wants to convert it into a restaurant. That's what he wants to do. Now, he's been around his mother and his grandmother, so he can cook, and he could cook quite well, but he has no idea how to run a restaurant whatsoever, but he takes all of the money that he got from the will or whatever, and I think it's something like $250,000. I mean, it's a chunk of change. And he takes all of it and he puts it down as a down payment on this derelict building that he wants to turn into a restaurant. And his friends are like, you're crazy. You wasted your money. I mean, it's very much like the mother in Jack and the Beanstalk who, sends Jack out to sell the cow that has no milk, and he comes back with 3 beans. And she's like, what are these 3 beans for? You were supposed to sell the cow for money, not 3 beans. And Jack says, well, they're magic beans. And she throws the beans out the window, and you know what happens. The beans turn into a beanstalk. And that's pretty much what's happening here. He's bought this derelict building, this rundown building with, the seed money, or what becomes the seed money that his mother had given him. And he's doing it in memory of her. And he's doing it to basically keep her alive, to keep his world alive. And his friends are very much like, oh, you're getting maudlin and nostalgic. And this is a silly thing to do. You made a terrific mistake, but we still love you anyway because we're friends and we just can't understand what you're about. But we love you anyway. But he has this idea. He has this idea of hiring nonas, of hiring grandmothers to do the cooking in this restaurant. And so that's the thing that's inspiring him. So it's more than just opening up an Italian restaurant and something like that. He wants the chefs not to be professional chefs, but to be grandmothers that he knows. Okay, so the first one that he goes and recruits, I think her name is Roberta, and she's played by this actress who was on The Sopranos or something like that. Anyway, she was his mother's best friend, and she is now living in an old age home. Basically, we used to call it a retirement center. It's a senior citizen center where all she does is take meds all day and complain about things. Nobody comes and visits her, not even her children come and see her. And she says to Joe, when he sees her, she says, I'm really sorry that your mother has passed, and I'm really sorry that I could not go to the funeral. I just couldn't. She was my best friend, and I just couldn't go. And he's like, that's all right. She wanted you to have this. And he gives her this beautiful pendant that she had always treasured, that his mother had. And she starts to cry, and she's just like, you must think I'm a horrible person. He's like, no, not at all. And he visits her, and he starts to, over their visits, he plants the idea of like, well, what do you think about cooking, for a restaurant that I'm opening? Okay, is basically what he says. And she's like, what? And he's like, I want to open this restaurant, and I want nonas. I want grandmothers to be the cooks, to be the chefs. And she's like, Joe, do you know how long it's been since I've cooked anything? It's like, I can't do anything like that. I'm in pain. I'm in a wheelchair, all these sorts of things. And he's like, well, think about it. And so, over visits, he prevails upon her to do it. And she says yes, because what he wants is grandmothers who are going to cook traditional dishes from their native country. That's the theme. So she says yes. And she's like, but I can't be the only cook. He's like, oh no, I've got other cooks coming. And she's like, okay, who are the other cooks? And he's like, come to the restaurant on Saturday and they'll show up. And during this time, one of his friends, who's a construction worker, he's building up this derelict building into a restaurant. And he's doing it out of love of Joe, out of the love of his friend. After he's done scolding Joe for having been foolish with this investment, he comes back and he's like, well, let me help you with it. I don't want to be the friend who said, I told you so. Let me help you build this and create something out of it, even though it's crazy. And so Roberta shows up on that Saturday, and they're waiting for other people. And she's like, did you take an ad in the paper? And he's like, no, I did something on, I think it's Craigslist or something like that. She's like, what's that? And he's like, you just sort of post something and people kind of show up. She's like, people kind of show up. And so two people do show up. One is Antonella, who is another Italian grandmother who he had met at an Italian food market, which is in the neighborhood. And she shows up and she immediately, starts bickering, or she and Roberta start bickering right off the bat. I think because one is from Sicily and another is from Genoa, or another part of Italy, and they don't get along. And this isn't turning out well. And then a third woman shows up that he has no idea who she is. And she's very shy. She's kind of mousy looking, and she's very retiring. And she says that I really want this job to be a chef. And so the three of them think that they're competing, for the chef, but he wants all of them to be chefs. He wants all of them to bring their best recipes to this restaurant. And during this whole time, he's trying to remember this one recipe that his mother had. It was tomato sauce, where the last sensation of the sauce was something sweet, and he's trying to replicate it with sugar or something like this, but it's not right. And Roberta jokes, listen, it was your mother's secret ingredient. It wouldn't be a secret if she told you, right? I mean, that's the whole thing. Everyone guards their recipes, And he's like, I know, but I just wish I could figure out, what that was. But that's also what I love about you guys. You all have your own recipes. You all have your secrets, that you're going to put into this. That's going to be wonderful. And so the three ladies are hopeful but practical, begrudging but can be easily talked into giving it a go. And so there's one more woman who comes, and her name is Gia, and she's played by Susan Sarandon, and she's the beautician. And she did Joe's mother's hair and did the wig when she had chemo and things like this. And she's a baker, and she runs her own salon and everything, but she wants to do something new. She wants to do something different. And she's, Susan Sarandon. She looks younger than the other ladies do. And her sweater is unbuttoned down to about the cleavage. And so whenever she is stirring the bowl or something like that, she's shaking a little bit like this and showing off her boobs, and they're like looking at her askance and things like this. And she's smacking gum and, the whole 9 yards. And so these four ladies come together and make this kind of like unlikely alliance. They're always getting into fights and arguments, except for the mousy one. And Gia also she's just like not even going to enter. It's the two first ones, Antonella and Roberta, who fight and argue the most. And so what they discover is different things about their background, that, Roberta's children don't talk to her anymore. She's alone. That's why she was in the senior citizen home. Antonella lost her husband a number of years ago, and she still talks to his photograph every day. The mousy one, she's a nun from the Bronx, I think, or thereabouts, who left the convent and is now making something for herself. And they discover that she's gay, and that's the reason why she left. And then there's Gia, the beautician. Okay. So they try to make this restaurant work. And of course, there's obstacles like they didn't get the zoning thing. I think Roberta tries to make a goat's head, which is a traditional Sicilian recipe or something like that, and smokes out the restaurant and causes a fire, and, they get shut down. But whenever they're shut down or whenever they hit a dead end, something happens. Joe knows someone, like there's a girl that he had grown up with, who is a lawyer, and she finds out that the person who's inspecting is taking bribes and threatens to expose him. And so he, says, yeah, you've got your restaurant. I mean, he always comes back from the brink and he puts the whole thing together. And what you have is these women finding a family and kind of adopting Joe. Joe's their boss, but he's also like their kid. And Joe has his nonas again, and they're really going to make something out of all of this. And so they're ready to open. They've perfected the menu. Everything's wonderful. And nobody comes. Nobody comes opening night. Nobody comes after the second week. Nobody comes after the third week. After a month, 6 weeks are going by. And, occasionally they get friends to come and eat. But, it's like 2 friends, 4 friends. That's it. It's not enough to keep a restaurant going. And Joe is doing everything he can to get reviewers to come out to Staten Island. But, the reviewers are in Manhattan. They're not coming out to Staten Island, and forget it. And, and so he goes to this one reviewer. He's connected to a TV station or whatever, and he serves the food of the grandmothers, and he's like, I don't do this. And he's like, let me just leave the food. He's like, you can leave it. And of course, no sooner does Joe leave than he tastes it. And he's like, And so it culminates with the restaurant shutting down. Joe can't keep it going. He doesn't have the money for it anymore. And it's not really about the money. It's about a place to basically keep the spirit of his mother and his grandmother alive, to revive these women who had sort of reached the end of the road or didn't know what else was going to come in their lives, and who sort of resigned themselves to some sort of senior citizen living, and where they were going to be nothing but reminiscing about the past and not doing anything creative, and just kind of languishing until whenever. And so they've gotten fired up and excited. They've forged these bonds with one another. It's an impossible task, but they're in it together. But Joe says, okay, I have to pull the plug. It's just not going to work. And they feel bad for Joe. They're like, we feel so bad for you, Joe. You tried so hard, and we really wanted to deliver. And it's a shame, that it ends up like this and things like that. And he's like, well, what I want to do is that we're going to have a closing night, and we've got all of this food. And they're like, we have a lot of food, and we have all this food, so let's not let it go to waste. And we're going to open it up to everybody. So call your friends, your relatives, grab people off the streets. It's a free dinner, and come on in. And so that's what they do. And in true Jupiter Cancer fashion, they open up the doors and they greet in friends and family, but mostly they're greeting in strangers off the street, people they don't know. It's free food. What do you want? Okay, so people show up for this. And there's just this wonderful evening of delicious food, of talking and of singing and of just coming together as a community. Some people know each other, many of them don't. And it's the food that bonds them. It's food and being around a hearth, being in this impromptu home where they just are enjoying one another. And what's not to be enjoyed with fine wine and full bellies and delicious Italian food? So the following day comes and he puts the closed sign up. And one of the people that had come to the restaurant, this guy from the Italian food market, says, Joe, I really have to apologize to you. And he's like, you have nothing to apologize for. What do you have to apologize for? And he's like, me and a bunch of the guys told people not to come to your restaurant. And he's like, oh, okay. Why? And he's like, because we were like, who's this guy? He's not from around here. He's not doing anything that's genuine or real. An old friend of ours owned this restaurant, and you had taken it over and thrown his sign out on the street. And we didn't like that. We didn't like that you had gone and done this. And you got these nonas together. We thought it was a gimmick, and a cheap gimmick. And we weren't happy about this. But I came last night. Some of the guys came last night. And we just had such a great time. And we just realized you're one of us. You're like family. We don't know who you are or whatever. But, your heart was in the right place. It was coming from the right place. And we feel so bad. And we know it's too late. And we just feel so bad about that. And Joe, I couldn't come and drink your wine and eat your food and not tell you this, And he's like, oh, it's okay. It's like, that makes perfect sense. And it would have been nice to have known this earlier, but, that's all right. But then when Joe is, locking up the restaurant, his friend who, redid the restaurant and things like that, Joe owes a lot of money to, comes running up and he says, look at this. And Joe's like, what? And it's a newspaper. And of course, it's a review. And it's been reviewed favorably. It talks about the nonas, the grandmothers, the food, the sense of belonging, how you need to go to this place, that there's nothing like it. It's a great jewel. Okay, you have to commute out to Staten Island, but it's worth it. And of course, in the telling of the tale, that's all it takes, that it's the cooking. They come back from the brink and the restaurant is born, I mean, you sort of want to say reborn or revived or something like that, but the restaurant is born. It's truly born. And so it goes on to become a success. Now, this happens to be based on a true story about, it's a guy named Joe who opened a restaurant and grandmothers cook there. And it's open to this day. It's super duper popular. And he's, I think, opened one or two others. And he's even brought in Mideast grandmas to cook Mideast food so that, as long as it's traditional food from your native country, that's what flies. And so it's expanded, it's become more international. And of course, the community and the patrons have expanded as well. But why I hold this as a story of a Jupiter retrograde is this. Jupiter is a planet of tests, just like Saturn is a planet of tests. Jupiter gives and Saturn withholds. Okay, that's how we know them. That's why Jupiter is a benefic and Saturn is a malefic. Jupiter gives, Saturn withholds. Okay, Saturn withholds to give you a hard time, to test you, to make you suffer its test trials and tribulations, to see if you're strong enough or smart enough or have ingenuity, to master the obstacles that are thrown in your way. He teaches through tests, okay? But Jupiter tests by giving you wonderful things and then pulling the plug on it, okay? So it's kind of like Joe gets the money from his mom, and it's this great idea. It's this great vision. He's going to remember his mother, honor his mother, basically build an altar to his mother and grandmother, which is the kitchen, the hearth itself. And this is going to become a successful restaurant. And the Vestal Virgins will be these Italian and later on Mideastern grandmothers, or people who cook, share, who become the center of this community. It's a beautiful vision, but it's also a naive one, which is pointed out countless times as he comes up against these obstacles. So Jupiter gives you something, gives you good fortune, okay? And Joe literally gets $250,000 to use as a down payment. It blesses you with these things. The grandmothers come together, and they're all inspired by the vision, and they're all great cooks, and things look like they're really going to be going places. There's bumps in the road, but it's not a big thing. But then Jupiter, when it turns retrograde, it pulls the plug. It pulls the plug on the things that you've gotten recently in your life. And it does this to test you. So what's the test? The test is to see if you appreciate, if you honor the good that has come your way, all right? So if you curse your fate, for example, for leaving you high and dry. Curse you, Jupiter. You gave me these wonderful things. I followed these cues. And then all of a sudden you pulled the plug on all of this and curse you. That's a horrible thing for you to do. Then you don't appreciate the good that had come into your life. And if your attitude is to surrender, to give up, to say, okay, we gave it our best shot and that's it, that's not honoring the good either. You gave up on something. And in a way, you gave up on being good, on doing good. Jupiter's mission, when it tests you, is to spread goodwill through the world through you. It gives you good things, and those good things are meant to beget more goodness around you. It's that idea of paying it forward. If someone does you a good turn, you do someone else a good turn, preferably a stranger, preferably someone you don't even know. And that's the way that Jupiter spreads bonhomie, good spirit, good feeling throughout the world. But if the plug is pulled, like that moment where Joe has to close the restaurant, and that could have just been like, oh, it was a bad idea, or, oh, I'm angry at fate for doing this. They close the restaurant, and what's Joe's response? Joe's response, because the grandmothers point out there's a lot of food left, you don't want it to go to waste. And he's like, you're right, it shouldn't go to waste. Let's open up a feast, which is such a Jupiterian ritual. And when you're talking about the zodiac sign of Cancer, you're talking about rituals. You're talking about traditions. You're talking about recipes that have been passed down intergenerationally. And what he does is that he opens up the restaurant and for free invites loved ones, friends, strangers into this place to feast. They're going to celebrate the restaurant that never came to be. Okay, they're going to celebrate for this moment, what it could have been and what it really is, which is about this sense of family that exists around people who aren't family with one another. And he's going to celebrate this. And this communal, this opening the doors, this making food available to the hungry, to inviting people in here, this is the thing that he does. And at this moment in the film, he opens the envelope that his mother had given him. She had written Joe on it. He opens the envelope and it's stuffed. It's a very thick envelope. And what it's stuffed with is all of his mother's recipes. He couldn't find her recipes. So she had taken all of her recipes and stuffed them in this envelope. And of course, among these recipes is the tomato sauce with the secret of what makes it sweet. And that this comes at the moment when he's saying goodbye to all of that. It's this beautiful moment of fortune smiling, of ancestors reaching out from the past and giving a gift. You've honored them and now they're honoring you. And by building this restaurant, this place where everyone comes, there's a sanctuary, there's a hearth, there's a home. Yeah, you have to pay to eat, but this restaurant isn't just some, restaurant, like Michelin 4-star, whatever. It's a place of home where everyone feels welcome. And this is Jupiter in Cancer. So what Jupiter retrograde is asking of you right now, if you feel like the plug has been pulled on your fortune, on your momentum, you're asking yourself, what have I been struggling for? Jupiter is simply asking you to do good. Will you still do good now that the good things aren't coming? And if you can still do good now that the good things aren't coming, then you will find that when Jupiter comes out of retrograde, it will reward you. It will reward you for having had the faith, for having had the belief in Jupiter's goodness all along. And this is something that you will see for yourself when Jupiter comes out of retrograde on February 4th, 2026. Signs most affected are Cancer, Scorpio, Sagittarius, and Pisces. On November 16th, there will be a grand trine in water. A grand trine is when you have 3 planets in each one of the 3 signs that share the same element. In this case, the sun will be in the zodiac sign of Scorpio. It will be forming a trine to Jupiter in the zodiac sign of Cancer, and then to Saturn in the zodiac sign of Pisces. When the sun does this, it forms a triangle, which is why it's called a trine, which is basically short for trinity or trigon. And it's this idea of a beautiful protective space, which is formed by these three planets in like element, the element being water. So grand trines confer good fortune, and grand trines also confer protection. The idea being that if you are experiencing good fortune, then you need to be protected from the people who are coveting it or who want to take it away from you. Personally, I've seen grand trines operate as protection in the element that they appear. For instance, if I see a grand trine in fire, usually this person has a very unique or very powerful personality that might not have fit in or been accepted into the family or the neighborhood or the culture that they were raised. That they might have felt eclipsed or thwarted or repressed or suppressed in some sort of way. But this grand trine in fire would have served as a protection. This person would have known that they were unique, that they were special, and that things weren't always going to be like this all the time. That at some point they're going to leave this family or neighborhood or culture and go someplace else and find people where this person will shine, where this person will be recognized. We'll find people who will celebrate the uniqueness of this person. And so if there's a grand trine in air, there might have been difficulties with creating friendships or relationships early in your life. And this goes on to become something that gives you great fortune or higher purpose later on in your life. If there's a grand trine in earth, you might have suffered in the area of health and wealth. And then later on, you go on to experience robust health and wealth. Same is true of water. You may have been hurt very deeply or gone through some very hard emotional difficulties and trials and tribulations, but you carried that water within you. If you have a grand trine in water, you carried that water within you, which means that you have the capacity to restore your own emotions, to replenish your emotions, that the experiences of life, although they may be painful and difficult and hard to handle, you always would have carried an emotional resilience, an ability to come back. And instead of being heartbroken, these difficulties in life actually may very well have expanded your heart or expanded your being in a way that you never could have imagined. So although a grand trine in water, for instance, might give great creativity or maybe even psychic ability and intuition, certainly a compassion and a sympathy and an understanding of people on a very deep level, which might inspire all sorts of things, like from being a therapist to a cook, as we just discussed, or a lyricist or something along those lines, or just being someone that people turn to, who people feel like emotionally you get them, you understand what's going on. And this may give you a sense of community and belonging, which you didn't have originally in your life. So a grand trine in water brings good things, but it also brings protection. It creates a safe space. And when you have a grand trine in water, it creates a safe space for your emotional life. So as I said, the sun, which will be in Scorpio, will form a trine to Jupiter in Cancer, and then to Saturn in Pisces, and this creates a triangle in the sky. This is the grand trine in water. But on a deeper level, I wanted to also share with you this wonderful quote, which comes from the martial artist Bruce Lee, who was very famous back in the 1970s. And it was inspired by Taoism. And he says in this interview, he's describing water. And what he says about water is this. He says to the interviewer, who asked him something like, what would you say to someone who's, wants to be a great martial artist or a good person or whatever? And so what Bruce Lee says is, be like water, making its way through the cracks. Do not be assertive, but adjust to the object, and you shall find a way around or through it. If nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. If you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, and it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend. What I love about this, and it was often quoted during the Hong Kong protests that were going on when China basically took over Hong Kong. But this is something that the protesters were saying to one another. They were saying, be like water. And what they were basically saying is that resistance isn't only just a show of strength. It isn't only just like, we're going to fight back or resist or stand our ground and, you will never beat us. And that's resistance. You standing your ground is something that we all understand as being resistance. But when they were sharing this quote from Bruce Lee, which was based on Taoism, they were talking about how water doesn't resist, okay? Water makes its way through the cracks. So in other words, don't be assertive, don't stand against, but like water, be fluid, adjust to the object. And if you adjust to the object which is coming towards you, you will find a way around or through it. So this isn't about locking horns. This is about adjusting or adapting to something that is countering you, to something that is oppressing you. And adapting doesn't mean giving up or surrendering. It means that when you adapt, when your shape adapts, you will find a way around something that's oppressing you, or you will find your way through it. What I really love is this line: if nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. I love that line. It's such a water sign line. Think about it. If nothing within you stays rigid, all right? Water can't be rigid. It's fluid. It flows. Even if it's not in motion, it's not rigid. It's simply still. Okay, so if nothing within you stays rigid, outward things will disclose themselves. How are outward things going to disclose themselves? Water reflects. The ocean will reflect the sky. The color of the ocean will reflect the sky. If it's a clear blue day, the ocean will be clear and blue. If it's gray and stormy day, the ocean will be gray and stormy. So this is where, by reflecting the things that stand outside of you, that's how the things that stand outside of you will disclose themselves. So the water doesn't disclose itself, okay? It reflects, okay? So if you're not rigid, where you're not like, okay, this is the stand I'm going to take and I'm not going to move, but if you basically allow yourself to be fluid, to be water, and you reflect back onto that person what that person is putting onto you, then what happens ultimately is that that person who's coming at you or oppressing you or going against you, they will disclose themselves. What they're doing will become known. What they're doing will become apparent. Maybe it will become apparent to society or to the world, but it will definitely become apparent to that person. And that's not going to happen if you lock that person in an opposition. It's going to happen if you're fluid, if you adapt, if you reflect back what that person is doing to you. And so then he goes on to say, empty your mind and be formless, shapeless, like water. I love that. Air is an element of the mind, okay? And air is all about thoughts and concepts and talking about things and listening to things, but it's a mind that is very active, okay? Fire is about an identity. Fire is the element that rules over the self. It rules over identity. Fire stands for the unique individualism that each one of us carries inside of one another. And earth, of course, is shape, it's form. There are rocks, there are mountains, there are buildings that are skyscrapers and fabulous and amazing feats of architecture. And there are buildings that are ramshackle and derelict and barely standing. The whole idea of earth and shape and form is that shape and form is separate from one another. It's separate from one another because this one object is heavier than another one that's lighter, or this item on sale is quite expensive, whereas this other item on sale is cheap. Okay, so Earth talks about the distinctions, the differences between shapes and forms. So here, Bruce Lee says, empty your mind and be formless. Water is formless. Okay, We see it because it's framed by continents and islands or something like that. But water is really formless. It's shapeless, like water. It's fluid. And that emptiness of the mind, which is the silence, the quiet of water, that formlessness of water, the fact that it takes on a shape that it's contained in, that shapelessness, these are the things that people can find frightening about water signs, okay? Because it's hard to pin them down, or the depths are so deep that they can't see their feet underneath. They have to sort of, if they're swimming, they have to sort of tread water. They don't know how deep something is. There's no ground beneath their feet. These are the things that can frighten people about water signs, but this is something that water signs enjoy. It's their native element. And then he says, if you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. It doesn't turn into a cup. The water takes the shape of a cup. If you pour it into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. The water takes the shape of the bottle. It fills the bottle so it can be transported, for instance. We all have water bottles, right? You put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. I mean, what makes a teapot different from a cup and a bottle? You turn on heat and it becomes tea. It becomes a beverage, something that you drink, something that gives you sustenance. So this is the changeability of water, but it is adapting to the shape that it is contained in. So there's a nothingness, there's a fluidity, there's an expansiveness, there's an intimacy. If it's in a cup, it's measured only in that cup. And then he says, now water can flow or it can crash. All right. So water can flow like a gentle stream or brook, or it can crash like an enormous wave that pounds the shore, and you hear that boom, if you've ever been around pounding surf. I mean, it's described as pounding surf. So this element can be both gentle, it can flow, and it can crash. And he says, be water, my friend. So water was an element that was really held perhaps most sacred by Taoists, because of its nothingness but somethingness, its fluidity, its inability to pin down. And yet it's the water of life. It's something that nourishes all of us. Now, this grand trine in water is very important. Water, as I said, restores. It replenishes. It gives us the water of life. It refreshes us. We feel replenished and refreshed after we experience this water energy in our life. And this is important because this is pretty much the last time that the slow-moving planets are going to be trining one another in water signs. Saturn and Neptune, after the Sun trines Jupiter and Saturn, it will trine Neptune. Saturn and Neptune will leave Pisces at the beginning of 2026, and Jupiter will leave the zodiac sign of Cancer on June 29th of 2026. After that, these planets will be in air and fire signs. So there's no water at all, at least according to the slower moving planets. So the climate essentially changes from a watery climate, and it's been changing from a water-earth climate to an air and fire climate. And so in essence, what's happening here is that you're being given an opportunity to dip your canteen, to dip your cup, to dip your thermos or your jar or yourself into water, and to carry that water inside of you as you go forward from here on in. And it will be a couple of years before we see one of the slower moving planets move back into water again. And so this idea of like, well, I'm going to be dehydrated, or I won't be able to have this, I'll become dried out, what's going to happen to my water, if you're born under Cancer or Scorpio or Pisces. What Bruce Lee is pointing out here is be water. Even if you're not even a water sign, even if you don't have a water sign rising or sun or moon, Bruce Lee is saying be water. Anyone can be water if you choose to. If you hold that in your consciousness, if you hold that energy inside of you, be that water. And if you are that water, you cannot be vanquished. You cannot be destroyed. You will find a way to adapt. You will find a way through the cracks. You will find a way to live your life, no matter what is leveled at you or thrown at you or tries to oppress you. This is why the protesters in Hong Kong really embraced this quote of his. And so people might say, well, the protesters in Hong Kong were arrested and they were destroyed and that's it. Well, that's it for now. Water keeps coming back. I've talked about the water cycle before. What is the water cycle? The waters in the ocean evaporate, they rise up into the sky and they form clouds. The clouds become heavy and they rain, and the water returns to the ocean again. So people or situations or your love life or career prospects might feel defeated now or oppressed now or having a hard time now, or the future may feel uncertain, but the future is not fixed. Be like water. Be fluid. Be fluid in the way that you relate to these obstacles or these difficulties in your life. And if you do that, you will never be destroyed. If anything, you will continue to replenish, to refresh, to come back, no matter what sort of trials or difficulties or obstacles you face. Be water. Signs most affected are Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces. On November 19th, there will be a new moon in the zodiac sign of Scorpio. There's a lot of fear and anxiety going around these days, and people are looking for some kind of relief. Now, a new moon in Scorpio isn't especially nurturing or empathetic, but rather straightforward and emotionally practical. This comes from a long history of pain and rejection. But instead of curling up into a ball, the Scorpio moon knows that everyone will experience what it has experienced at some point in their lives. On one hand, this gives the Scorpio moon the satisfaction of, now you know what it's like. But also, this creates camaraderie and it forms a bond, which is why you can expect coworkers, acquaintances, and even strangers to open up to you during this time about the most personal things. You may feel like you have to solve the problems that they are unloading on you, but you don't. All they want is a safe place to share, to divulge, and even vent. They know that you understand what they're going through, and the simple fact that they can talk to you about it is all the solace that they need. Signs most affected are Cancer, Scorpio, Capricorn, and Pisces. On November 20th, Uranus and Taurus will form a sextile to Neptune in the zodiac sign of Pisces. This is an amazing sextile that's taking place. First of all, sextiles are wonderful aspects in astrology. In my opinion, they're often undervalued. What a sextile is that it is an understanding that exists between two elements that are not the same, but they're alike. We have 4 elements in astrology: water, earth, air, and fire. Water and earth are seen as being the feminine or the yin elements, and air and fire are seen as being the masculine or the yang elements. Water and earth are 2 elements that complement one another, all right? And what I mean by complement is that they encourage or help the other one to be the best that it can possibly be. The best example of an earth-water sextile is the idea of growth, all right? You plant a seed in the soil and you water it and it grows into a plant. And that's an example of a sextile between earth and water. These elements are all about growing things. Now, when we have Uranus retrograding back down into Taurus, and we have Neptune, which is already retrograded back down into the zodiac sign of Pisces, the zodiac sign that it rules, we have this notion of going back, of retrograde. And a lot of times we'll think of a retrograde as being regressive, okay, that we were making this progress and now we've either become stunted in our progress or we're regressing, we're slipping back down the hill. Now, retrogrades don't have the best reputation in astrology, okay, because they're pretty much seen as being backward, okay? It describes a period of time when the planet appears to be moving backward in the sky. And so retrograde, if you even think about the word retrograde, when someone says, oh, that's so retrograde, that means basically, oh, that's so backward, okay? That's so more progressed people or enlightened people know better than to do this because by doing this action or believing in that particular belief or following that way of living, it's so retrograde, it's so backward, it's so, yesterday. It's not today, or it's not tomorrow, which is even better, which is progressive. We want our planets to be moving forward and to be progressive, because we want to see what lies beyond the next corner. But when a planet is retrograde, when it's moving backwards in the sky, you can feel a dip in your energy. You can feel like you're regressing, which is also associated to the notion of retrograde, and that you're being drawn backwards. Maybe you're being drawn back into a situation that you thought you had left, or you have to return or revisit it. It can be like the kid in third grade who finds out that they're not going to the fourth grade and that they're going to have to repeat the third grade. It's humiliating. I have to repeat this grade. And, maybe the other kids are laughing and saying, haha, and all these sorts of things. But what we forget about a retrograde is that a retrograde is really about going back, as I said, but it's traveling back over the ground that you just traveled forward over. And in traveling back over, you may find things that you overlooked the first time that you were sort of rushing past this patch of sky. You might rediscover things that you overlooked along the way. So you can perfect those abilities and those skills so that not only can you enter the next grade, the fourth grade, but you can excel. You can even do better. So this idea of going backward in order to go forward is actually a positive thing, because you're learning more and you're prepping yourself and you're equipping yourself for moving on forward into the future. So when we have this idea of Uranus going backward and Neptune going backward, and they're forming a sextile, it puts me in mind of restoration, of restoring something that had been lost. We've all seen those shows on television where someone, takes a castle or a house or something like that, and they refurbish it, they restore it, they bring it back to life. And at first we're like, oh, what a marvelous castle, or what a marvelous home. And then we see what they have to go through and how inventive they have to become, or the money that they spend, or the help that they get from friends and community, or the wonderful lost objects that they find. It becomes an adventure back into the past. And we're kind of thinking, oh, it's a time machine and we're restoring something and bringing it, back to life. Earlier in this episode, I shared with you the Silicon Valley Tech Bro motto, which was move fast and break things. And we talked about how that's essentially, if you really think about it, unsustainable. Yes, you can see that it's about innovation and invention and you keep on moving, but no one can just keep on moving like that. We're not built that way, and life doesn't work that way. So with this idea of going back and restoring what has been broken, bringing back something that people moved and gave up as being ridiculous. There's wisdom in that soil. There's wisdom in that memory. And so there's a way that we can sort of take what we've learned and what we've experienced, and we can use that to restore something that is broken. Perhaps what you've learned in your life is that this was something you didn't want to be broken, or perhaps you are salvaging a situation or a piece of furniture that you see the beauty and the value in, and maybe the person who threw it out didn't see the value in it. Now, as I said, that could be like a broken down chair or something like that you find in the back of a room somewhere, or at an antique sale or something along those lines. And so that you restore it, that can definitely be here, but it might also be a relationship or a situation in your life that you are intent on bringing back to life. So you may discover during this period of time when retrograde Uranus forms a sextile to retrograde Neptune, that you restore something that had been thrown out, that had been seen as useless, or you might be restoring something which was seen as useless, but is now pertinent because its time has come. Signs most affected are Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. On November 22nd, the sun enters the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. Sagittarius, to me, is a very complex sign. Perhaps it's made all the more complex by its simplicity. At first, we look at a sort of mythical creature. It's a centaur. It's half man and it's half horse. And it's usually carrying arrows and it's firing these arrows at something. Maybe it's a person, Maybe it's a target, maybe it's trying to get a bullseye, something along these lines. So with this creature, which is half man, half horse, there's a wild side to Sagittarius, which we often read about in astrology books. Sagittarians are carousers, they're wild. They need to be free. They don't want to be penned in. That's the horse part of this centaur. They want to be out in wide open plains and galloping off into all kinds of distances. So there's a sort of restlessness that's born into the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. They need their freedom and they're restless, and they pretty much subscribe to the motto, anywhere but here. Okay, so Sagittarians are always thinking about the other places they could be right now, and hopefully they're on planes and jetting off to them, and if not, they're very much distracted by it, or they're researching how they can go and visit this country or hang out with this different group of people. So the wonder of the world and living in the world is very strong and very powerful in Sagittarius. Indeed, the divine is experienced out in the world. This is not a sign that's waiting for the end of the world and for heaven to descend and all these sorts of things. This is a sign that celebrates the divine in life. There are places that you can go in the world that will just strike you silent with their majesty. Certain mountains or beaches or oceans or faraway corners of the world. Here you can experience the divinity of God, the majesty of nature. These are all things that are going to be wound up in the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. But another thing that I find fascinating about Sagittarius, it's a fire sign, right? And when the ancients talked about the element of fire, they weren't just talking about like a roaring fire or something that you cooked meat on. The fire that they were talking about was the fire in the sky, the stars. Indeed, the Persians regarded the stars in the sky as being the campfires of the gods, all right? That you could go out at night and see the gods sitting at their campfires and looking down at all of us here on Earth. So fire was seen as being the stars, the lights in the sky itself. What's fascinating about Sagittarius is that it comes at that time of year when the sun is leaving us, okay? It's the last zodiac sign of the autumn, and it precedes Capricorn, which is going to be the sign of the winter solstice, at least how the seasons are experienced here in the Northern Hemisphere, which is where Western astrology originates. So with the first fire sign, which is Aries, we have a spring sign. And so here, this is the sun bursting into life. It's at the beginning of the agricultural year. So Aries is all about starts and beginnings and things growing and coming to life. So this is a young sun, the sun that is in Aries. It's a sun that's beginning the agricultural year. So it's very eager about getting out and making things grow and making things happen, which are things that people born under Aries or have Aries rising, sun or moon also share, that sensibility of the urgency of making things happen. So during the agricultural year, the sun rises to Leo, where it is in domicile, where it is at home. And so where Aries is striving to get to that throne in the sky, the sun in Leo is about sitting on the throne in the sky. So this is what gives people born under Leo their majesty, their confidence. They get to sit on the throne at the height of summer, the season of abundance. So what's fascinating is that the last of the fire signs to follow in the succession is Sagittarius. And it comes at the last month of autumn. It comes at the very end of autumn. And so where the two previous signs have been about the sun arriving and then the sun, shining in the sky, being at its most robust, its most life-giving, here we have the sun sinking. Okay, it's leaving us. Days are getting shorter, nights are growing longer, and everyone is getting colder. And so the sun is departing. It's leaving us. And so what is that saying? I mean, what does Sagittarius have to do with that? What Sagittarius has to do with that is its ruling planet, which is Jupiter. Jupiter is basically the planet of faith. It's the planet of the way that you envision God. So Jupiter in Sagittarius is about this faith. It's this belief when you're looking into the darkness, okay? Which is a quality that doesn't get a lot of airplay when people talk about Sagittarius. I mean, when we talk about Sagittarius, Sagittarius is sporty and it's horsey and it horses around and it's a party animal and wants to have a lot of fun. And certainly it's associated to the holidays where people are going to Christmas parties and having a lot of fun or horsing around or things along those lines. But there's also something very reverent about the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. We've watched the sun, start a new year, rise to its throne, sit on it. Now it's left that throne. And so the sky isn't full of light. The earth isn't full of heat. This is a period of time in which the light is vanishing and the earth is growing colder and colder. And so the image that I have of that sun in Sagittarius is the image of a candlelight. Okay, it's a simple candlelight. And so it's not a roaring fire. It's not light that is filling the sky. It's a candlelight. It's a candlelit faith that we carry within us through the approaching dark times, the dark times of winter. And this is what I think Sagittarius also embodies, and what it symbolizes is the faith that is carried within ourselves. I mean, think of a candle in a lantern. There's a lot of images of that in the occult and in spiritual art, of a candle in a lantern, whether it's a hermit using candle light or a lantern to find his way in the dark to understand knowledge, or whether it's Christ, with the lantern knocking on the door to see if someone will open it up and admit Christ into their home, admit Christ or welcome Christ into their hearts. Christ the wanderer, Christ the stranger, Christ the person who doesn't belong there, knocking at the door with the lantern. So these are ideas to think about when we think of the sun going into Sagittarius, that it's that faith, that we're going through times that might be dark, they might be frightening, but we carry within us a faith. And the faith isn't wishful thinking. It isn't like, oh, it will all turn out well in the end or anything like that. It's a faith that you have in yourself, and it's a faith that you have in humanity, and it's a faith that you have in this world, that ultimately where things are going is to a better place, that it's about people rising to the occasion of themselves, people sharing a generosity, expressing a love of their fellow person, a love of this planet, instead of exploiting it and ruining it. That's the sort of faith, a faith of living here in this beautiful natural world. This is something that is worth reflecting upon and thinking about during this period of time that the sun is moving through the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. And the sun will be in Sagittarius from November 22nd until December 21st. Signs most affected are Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. On November 26th, there will be another grand trine in water, but this time it will be Venus in Scorpio, forming a trine to Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Pisces. Now, when we talked about the previous grand trine in water, we talked about the sun being in Scorpio and forming the trine to Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Pisces. And so what we're really talking about is the identity, the personality of water, and pretty much what to expect as a person. What does it mean to you personally when the sun is forming a grand trine in water? This time it's going to be Venus that's forming the grand trine in water, and Venus talks about people. It talks about your relationship to other people, the caliber of your relationship, the depth of your relationship, the longevity of your relationship, the fulfillment, or the dissatisfaction or frustration with your relationships. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Venus is in detriment in the zodiac sign of Scorpio. And the reason for this is that Venus is in detriment in Mars-ruled signs. Venus is the planet named after the goddess of love and beauty, and ultimately peace and courtesy. Mars is named after the Roman god of war, and as you might imagine, a planet associated to the goddess of peace is going to have a hard time when it's traveling through zodiac signs that are ruled by a planet that is named after the god of war. All right, so this is why Venus is in detriment in those particular zodiac signs. Probably also because Venus has a tendency to attract that kind of Mars energy into your life. It might attract a lot of provocation. It might attract unwanted attention. It might attract people fighting over you. It might attract domineering personalities into your life. If you have Venus in Aries or Scorpio, you're used to attracting troubled or troubling personalities into your life, and your relationships may also have that kind of a quality. There may be something that's disruptive about them. There may be something that is troubling, or it breaks up other relationships or causes problems. There's a lot of drama when Venus is traveling through a Mars-ruled sign like Aries, and particularly Scorpio. Now, when we've got Venus in Scorpio forming a trine to Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Pisces, basically what's happening with this is that you're meeting people at the same depth. You're meeting people at the same level. In other words, Venus in Scorpio is going to want to go deep. Okay, it's going to attract into its life people who are struggling or going through difficult times. And Venus in Scorpio understands that. Now, if you happen to be born under a zodiac sign that understands that sort of watery Scorpio energy, this is going to be a wonderful time for you. Okay, this is going to be a time in which it's like, wow, that person looks great. They're really hot. Plus they have like a delicious secret, or there's something wonderfully naughty about them. Okay, so it can be very sexy. It can be very hot going through something like this. And there can be, you're not being Bonnie and Clyde in the sense of robbing banks or anything like that, but there can be a sort of Bonnie and Clyde wildness that's going on when Venus is moving through Scorpio and making these trines. But there's also, on a deeper level, a feeling that crisis is bringing you and another person together. Okay, that maybe you're going to be together for a little while, it's a passing thing, or maybe you're going to be together forever. Scorpio is a fixed sign, by the way, but you're finding each other at a time in both of your lives in which there's a crisis. There's a difficulty that's going on, and you're finding camaraderie with one another. That person gets you, you get that person, you're in it together. Or maybe you're in a relationship with someone in which you're facing a crisis together. You're wondering if you're going to make it, and you're finding that actually facing the crisis, even though it's a crisis and not anything you would ever wish upon, even your worst enemy, there's something about it that brings you and this person together. It's bringing out aspects in both of you, maybe even aspects in your relationship that you never thought were there before, and they're there now, and it's really kind of extraordinary and very encouraging and very bonding. Okay, that can be something that's going on here as well. Now, Venus in Scorpio also has a reputation for being associated with things like betrayals, or someone cheating on you, or being abandoned or left. Okay, these aren't really lovely qualities, and they're not lovely experiences. They're awful, going through something like that. And if you've been betrayed, or you've been rejected, or hurt, or abandoned, or left, or cheated, either someone cheats on you in the relationship, or someone cheats you out of finances, or runs away with someone that was your spouse, that puts you in a place of terrible rage and hurt and anger, And Scorpio, because it's one of the 3 zodiac signs of justice, the first is Libra, which is justice in the form of the letter of the law. And the second one is Scorpio, which is revenge. Okay, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And the third sign of justice is Sagittarius, which is clemency, interpreting things in terms of the spirit of the law. You stole something, so we have to chop off your hand. But, in Sagittarius, we're going to go with the spirit of that. It's like you stole something that's bad, but we're going to rehabilitate you. We're going to find a way for you to understand that what you did was wrong, and to find a better way of living and taking care of yourself. And by taking care of yourself, taking care of others and living a better life and making society a better place. So there's a clemency or a mercy that can show up in the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. It has a tendency to interpret things in the spirit of the law, in the spirit of doing good, in the spirit of mercy. That's not really on the Scorpio radar. Now, does that mean that Scorpios are unable to understand that? No, they can understand it. They struggle with it a lot because Scorpio is Mars ruled. So that rage and that anger has a tendency to really come first and to flood the psychic zone of Scorpio rising suns and moons everywhere. And so this eye for an eye retaliation can be very Scorpio and very Venus in Scorpio. I want revenge for the bad things that have been done to me. I want that person to suffer as well, or I'm suffering and I'm feeling this pain and this anger and it's never going to go away because I was hurt and I want some kind of satisfaction. And who you want that satisfaction from, we don't know. It could be seeing the person who caused you harm, bad things befall them, or you want it from life, or there's an anger, and anger can be a source of strength with Scorpio. Now, the flip side to an eye for an eye, which is that retaliatory thinking, like you took out my eye, I'll take out yours. The flip side to eye for an eye is the phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself, and we're all familiar with that phrase, love thy neighbor as thyself. It first appears in the Torah, Leviticus 19:18, and then it also appears in the Gospel of Matthew 22:39, the idea of love thy neighbor as thyself. That is the flip side of an eye for an eye. And so the question that you may be facing with this grand trine in water taking place with Venus in Scorpio, forming a trine to Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Pisces, is a very simple question, really, which is, do I really want to spend the rest of my life being bitter? All right. And that's a big question, because when you feel like you've been robbed and you feel like you've been cheated and when you feel like you've been betrayed, all right, and there's good reason to feel that, what do you do with that? Other than be angry and be hurt and to vent and, what do you do with that? But what can also happen is that when that happens to you, it can infect you with a virus, okay? It can infect you with a virus that takes over your life, okay? Where you've been hurt, you've been abandoned, you've been left, and that kind of dark fire becomes the reason for being, And it doesn't even have to be wishing horrible things on another person. It can just be a dark fire. There can be anger can become willpower, especially if you've been hurt. But what you can also see, especially if something's been taken from you, which was your life, if you continue to be bitter with that, it will take over your life. That will be your life. It will be an embittered life. And there's no satisfaction. If you've lost someone, that person can't be returned. If the money's been taken, that money's gone. You cannot be reimbursed. If a situation has left you in a horrible place, it's gone. And so that decision, and it's more than just letting go, okay? It's just like, it's a conscious decision that if I stay with this anger and if I stay with this bitterness, this is what the rest of my life is going to be about. And so you have to sort of go against the current of that. And you have to choose yourself and the life you want to live over what has happened to you in your life. That is a staggering demand. That is almost an unthinkable challenge, which is why this grand trine in water is here to help. Water softens. Water finds its way through the cracks. Water finds its way under an obstacle. Water can evaporate, pour down to the ocean, and appear again. Water can refresh and water can restore. And maybe this is connected to forgiveness, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's got nothing to do with forgiveness. You can be angry at someone and rail at someone, but it doesn't have to take over your life. You can still be free to live the life you want to live. And I think that that's the message of this grand trine in water. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Bring that recognition of love back to you, and it doesn't mean that you're going to love the person who did you harm or anything like that, but you're not going to give them the satisfaction of ruining your life. So this is where you bring that water back to you and you find the people in your life that you love, that you enjoy, and you go on with your life replenished, restored, and made whole again. Signs most affected are Taurus, Cancer, Libra, Scorpio, and Pisces. On November 27th, Saturn comes out of retrograde, and you will feel its presence immediately. It will be like the end of Dr. Seuss's Cat in the Hat, when the mom comes home after having been away. Some people will resent having to clean up their act in a hurry, while others will welcome the return of a sense of order that's been sorely missed. Signs most affected are Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces. On November 29th, Mercury comes out of retrograde. Mercury out of retrograde is usually a time of celebration. Many people will say, "Yay, Mercury's out of retrograde. Come out, wherever you are." You know, it's kind of like Glinda calling out to the Munchkins who've hidden themselves while the Wicked Witch of the West showed up and strutted about their village, thrusting her broom in threatening sorts of ways at them. Well, she's departed, and now life returns to normal. And so the expectation is like, my life returns to normal. No more monkey wrenches being thrown at me by Mercury retrograde. I can get things back on track again. And to an extent, that can be true. But to do that, you sort of miss out on some of the things that Mercury retrograde might have given you. Being made to travel back over the ground that you had traveled before, that can be something that we do because we have to do, or it's something that we do and we discover things that we overlooked, that we didn't really value in the way that those things should be valued. We might be like, it's kind of like if you go through your old journals or something and you're like, you know what? This is a real good piece of writing that was done here. Or maybe you find an old video of yourself singing or something and you're like, you know what? That was pretty good. So going back and rediscovering something can be very valuable, not only in terms of making us feel like, hey, those lyrics were pretty good, or I could have been Madonna, or something along those lines, but on a deeper level, it's more like touching base with a skill, with a talent, with something that was important to you. And maybe you can't dance in the way that you used to, or sing in the way that you used to, or something like that. But there's still a talent there. There's still a skill there. There's still an aspiration. There's still an acumen, all right? And this is something that you sort of want to take another look at during this period of time that Mercury is moving forward in the sky again. Now, remember, you're not out of the woods yet. And that's because Mercury doesn't change signs, i.e. return to the zodiac sign of Sagittarius, which is the zodiac sign it was in when it turned retrograde before. So you're going to want to give yourself until December 11th. But be a little bit less like, yay, I've got things back on track. And be a little bit more like, well, where do I go from here? And how do I take the things that I learned or discovered and apply them to my life? You may find that these discoveries or these insights or finding another alternate route to getting from point A to point B, that these things are more valuable than you originally thought. That, in other words, you wouldn't have discovered them had you not gone through the Mercury retrograde. Accidents often play an incredible role in a discovery or the revelation of something. We would never have discovered it had things gone according to plan, but because things have not gone according to plan, I never would have seen myself in that way, or I never would have thought that I was capable of such a thing. Those are things that I want you to keep in mind as Mercury comes out of retrograde and is forward moving again. They might not seem like much now, while Mercury is sort of getting itself back on track and moving through Scorpio, but I can promise you that once Mercury re-enters the zodiac sign of Sagittarius, the zodiac sign that it turned retrograde in, they will be worth their weight in the wealth of experience. Signs most affected are Gemini, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, and Pisces. On November 30th, Venus enters the zodiac sign of Sagittarius. Everyone's mood improves when Venus enters Sagittarius, even the economies. That's because Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, the planet of good fortune and bonhomie. You'll find people to be more generous with their time and their money, which means that the next 3.5 weeks are perfect for passing around the hat if you're looking to raise money or build support for a worthy cause. Nobody will be able to refuse you. However, you could hit a speed bump when Venus forms a square to Saturn on December 20th. This may be when you have to switch horses in order to get to where you want to go. Signs most affected are Aries, Taurus, Leo, Libra, and Sagittarius. If you enjoyed what you saw, please press the like button. It helps more than you know. If you could subscribe, that would be wonderful. I've had such a wonderful time visiting with you this week, and I can't wait to get together next time on Christopher Renstrom Astrology.